You have tuned into The Voice of Medicine, the medical podcast filled with remarkable stories, first-hand experience, important research, and valuable life lessons. Open your mind, relax, and enjoy. Welcome everybody to a new episode with me, Michael, and Professor Anna Lembke, who is an associate professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences. She also is working in the field of pain medicine at the Stanford Medical Center. She's currently the director of addiction medicine at the Stanford University Medical School. As a book author, one of the topics that she is focusing on is drug prescription epidemic in the US. She wrote the book Drug Dealer: How Doctors Were Duped, Patients Got Hooked, and Why Is It So Hard to Stop?
Thanks for inviting me.
My pleasure. And I want to talk to you today about a couple of topics, which are your specialties. Of course, first would be addiction, then depression, bipolar disorder. But additionally, I would also like to hear your personal opinion about spirituality. I think this is something that you were talking about, and but also the cooperation between the disciplines inside medicine, such as, for example, endocrinology with psychiatry. I think this is something what has been not talked about quite much yet. So where to start? I would like to know, why did you choose the field of psychiatry? Let's start with a warm-up question like that.
Okay, good. So, well, I think big picture, I chose psychiatry because I'm more interested in quality of life rather than quantity of life. So I want to help people live their best lives. I'm not as interested in extending life at all cost. Also, medicine has changed remarkably in the United States in the past 30 years. And one of the major ways that it's changed is that doctors have today very little time with their patients in individual visits, and there's also not much continuity of care. And I was really interested in having ongoing, in-depth relationships with my patients, and psychiatry afforded that in ways that other specialties didn't. So those were the big pulls for me to go into psychiatry.
Okay, I understand. And why did you specialize in addiction?
So addiction came about unintentionally. In fact, I would say I had an aversion to treating those types of patients when I first became a psychiatrist. The reasons for that are many, including the fact that I wasn't trained in medical school to think of addiction as an illness. I didn't have a toolkit for addressing these problems in clinical care. And also I had my own negative countertransference toward addicted patients, and by that I mean I had my own biases and sort of ill-informed thoughts about addicted patients, that they could never get better, that it was a problem that was not within the purview of psychiatry. I didn't want to deal with those complicated patients. So I had a lot of sort of negative associations. But what I realized pretty early on in the practice of psychiatry is that my patients were not getting better. And I also realized through a number of cases where I actually harmed patients because I didn't ask them about drug and alcohol use, and only later found out that they were struggling with those problems. So I kind of had, for lack of a better word, a come to Jesus moment where I realized I better learn about addiction or I'm not going to be a very good psychiatrist. And the fun thing for me was that when I actually started asking my patients about drugs and alcohol, they were really eager to talk about it. My don't ask, don't tell policy that had preceded that was really my issue and not their issue. I also discovered that when I actually focused on and tried to help people with substance use or drug and alcohol problems, that they really got much better in ways that they hadn't when I was just throwing pills at them.
So it's really just about getting into a point where you're asking the right questions and let people talk about what perhaps they wanted to tell you, but they didn't get the incentive to talk about it. Okay. So in Europe, I would say that we have a larger problem with alcoholism that we actually think we have. And the more Eastern, European you go, the larger the problem gets. The thing is, sometimes people ask me, and as a junior, on my way to become a psychologist, sometimes people ask me, okay, how do I know I am addicted, for example, to alcohol? Where is the threshold? And I have to admit, often I don't know. I don't know. Okay, is it at the point where you cannot, go to a social venue without having a drink, or is it already when you're at home and you feel a craving for a drink? And what exactly are the mechanisms of addiction? Could you tell us something about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's fair to say that the struggles that you have helping people know whether or not they're addicted are reasonable struggles, because the definition has changed over time. If you put 10 psychiatrists in a room with one patient, they might disagree about whether or not a given patient is addicted or not. These are complex biopsychosocial diseases, and again, the definitions have changed. But I would say from a neuroscience perspective, what's very exciting about the field of addiction is that we have amazing neuroscience in the last 50 to 100 years, specifically around the changes that happen in the brain as a result of prolonged exposure to addictive substances. And specifically, what we know is that over time, these substances, which initially make us feel good, cause changes in the brain such that we kind of recalibrate or adapt to those positive kinds of influences from the drug, and we change our set point for experiencing pleasure and pain such that it gets harder and harder to get pleasure from that substance. And then when we don't have it, we're kind of in a chronic state of dis-ease, right? So I think this is really kind of the fundamental idea behind the disease model of addiction, is that chronic heavy exposure to these drugs cause brain changes that reset our pleasure-pain threshold, making it harder and harder for us to experience pleasure over time, and making that substance really the only thing that we enjoy anymore. Then we start to invest a lot of our time and resources in finding that drug and using that drug. And when we're not using that drug, we kind of experience a global anhedonia, or lack of pleasure. So that's one of the major neurological hallmarks. The other sort of definitional piece that has to do with behaviors, the way that we essentially define addiction, is continued compulsive use of a substance despite harm to self or others. So this is a really key piece. Aristotle talked about wide-eyed incontinence. And what he meant by that was when we engage in a behavior, even when we no longer want to be doing it, and even when we are aware that the downstream consequences are bad. And so those are the kinds of things that you look for when you're trying to diagnose addiction. You look for those sort of the change of the hedonic or pleasure set point. You look for continued use despite consequences. And sometimes we use the acronym or the mnemonic of 3 C's. Of course, you have to speak English to get the 3 C's, but the first C is compulsive use, so where there's a sort of automatic quality to it. I didn't mean to drink, but I did. The second C is for control. I only meant to have 1 drink, but I had 6. And the third C is for consequences, continued use despite consequences. And those consequences can take many forms. It can mean a disruption in my personal relationships. It can mean a lack of my ability to perform at work or to be the kind of parent that I want to be. So that's basically how we think about it from a neuroscience perspective and how we define it clinically.
How is dopamine involved in all this? Could you give us a little, very brief summary on that?
Sure. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitters are the molecules that get tossed around between neurons and allow neurons to communicate with each other. And dopamine is the major neurotransmitter thought to be involved in the experience of pleasure, particularly in this particular region of the brain that we call the reward pathway. The big difference between substances that are addictive, like alcohol, and substances that are not, like broccoli, is the amount of dopamine that they release in the brain's reward pathway. So the bottom line is that addictive substances release a lot of dopamine, and substances that are not addictive don't release very much dopamine at all, or maybe none at all for broccoli in my case. So that's basically an incredible oversimplification, but essentially what it comes down to is dopamine is probably the final common pathway for all addictive substances, and the addictive potential of a substance is a combination of how much dopamine it releases and how fast it releases that dopamine. So that's why, for example, smoking or injecting a drug is more addictive usually than eating it, because smoking or injecting goes right to the brain and causes a very fast surge in dopamine release.
So it's also the way how the substance gets into one's body that alternates the intensity of dopamine release. All right. What I wanted to ask you is also how is there a individual difference between people in terms of the susceptibility to to certain kinds of addictions. I know, for example, that people, who are rather higher on the scale of self-regulation, probably are harder to get addicted to any kind of substance than those who are rather impulsive.
Sure. So there are known risk factors for becoming addicted, and some people are more vulnerable than others. The way that I broadly conceptualize those risk factors is to divide them into nature, nurture, and neighborhood. So let's just go through those. So nature means the vulnerability that you inherit. And we do believe that there is an inborn genetic vulnerability to develop addiction. We base that on family studies showing that if you have a parent or a grandparent with a biological parent or grandparent with a history of addiction, you're at increased risk of developing addiction compared to the general population. And that's based on family studies, looking even at people who have a parent or grandparent with addiction raised outside of that addictive environment. So we're pretty sure it's not just the modeling of addictive coping, it's actually the genetics. And yes, you're right. The thought is that the heritable component has something to do with the ability to delay gratification. Those who delay gratification may be less susceptible to addiction. It has to do with an inborn trait called impulsivity. Impulsivity is my inability to put a pause between my desire or thought to do something and actually doing it. And we know that people who are more impulsive, which is an enduring trait, are more likely to get addicted. We know that people who have attention deficit problems like ADHD, attention deficit disorder, are at higher risk for addiction, etc. So there is this inborn component. Then we come to nurture, which is the developmental piece of it. And we know that people who are raised in abusive homes, who are raised in addictive homes, who are raised in homes that are not necessarily traumatic, but where parents model and condone substance use, those are all increase the risk of becoming addicted. Then finally, what I like to really focus on, because people forget about it, is the very important risk factor of neighborhood. What do I mean by that? I mean that if you are raised in a neighborhood where people are selling and using drugs on the street corner, you are more likely to try those drugs and you are more likely to get addicted. Other aspects of neighborhood are things like unemployment, things like homelessness. Those are all risk factors for addiction. What I didn't mention, which fits somewhere between nurture and nature, is co-occurring mental illness. If you have a co-occurring mental illness, you're also at increased risk for addiction. So yes, there are lots of risk factors, but don't forget about simple access as a risk factor. also, you started out by asking about drug of choice. So that's a little bit of a different phenomenon and a very interesting one. Basically, what's fascinating is the enormous inter-individual differences between people in their natural liking of a substance. So many of my alcohol-addicted patients will tell me that they knew from the first sip that they were in trouble with alcohol. Which is interesting, right? There was something innate about their brains that just absorbed that. Now, me personally, I happen to not like alcohol. It doesn't agree with me. Likewise, caffeine doesn't do anything for me. So I am relatively, let's say, impervious to those drugs. On the other hand, my brain loves opioids, right? So I've gotten opioids, fentanyl during a minor surgery that I had, and I never felt better than when I had those opioids in my system. So there is this very interesting kind of drug of choice phenomenon that we don't fully understand, but which has an impact on whether people use drugs and what drugs they use.
Thank you very much for explaining this for us. You also mentioned the co-occurring mental difficulties. So I know that, for example, a lot of people who are having anxiety attacks or have depression, they would also, in many cases, have some kind of addiction. Sometimes using it even as a coping strategy. So I knew a few people who would say, "Well, I have an anxiety. I need to smoke a couple of cigarettes, and that calms me down, or maybe have a glass of whiskey or something like that." So what's your experience with this dual problem that people have?
Yeah, so what you're alluding to is what's been called the self-medication hypothesis, and it originated with a psychoanalyst who I think may have been a Swiss psychoanalyst. I'll have to look that up again. His name was Sander Rado. And he published in the early 1900s. He was an acolyte of Freud. And he was the first one to sort of coin this phrase self-medication. And he had a theory that people who become addicted to drugs and alcohol are in fact self-medicating an underlying psychiatric condition. And if only we could treat that underlying psychiatric condition, then they wouldn't use these drugs. Now, as it turns out, there's only partial truth to that, because what we've learned is that even when we treat the underlying psychiatric condition, people don't necessarily stop using their drug of choice. And we believe now that these are actually related but separate pathways. That is, depression, if that's the mental illness, and addiction, right? So the way that I like to think about this is that there are many doors into substance use. One of the doors is to feel better or to feel happy, recreational use. But the other major door for a lot of people is to solve a problem. That problem may be anxiety, it may be insomnia, it may be social phobia. But even if your door into using substances is to solve a problem, the effects on the brain are the same, and you can still get addicted. And once you do, if we don't treat the addiction as its own problem, you're not going to get better. So when patients come to me, they often come to me and say, "Doctor, I'm just self-medicating my depression or my anxiety. And if you could just treat that, I wouldn't have to drink or I wouldn't have to use drugs." And I say to them, you know what? I believe you that you started out self-medicating and it still feels like self-medicating. But I can tell you that even if I could wave a magic wand and get rid of your anxiety, I highly doubt that you would stop drinking, because at this point you've developed a separate problem. The other thing, too, is that this self-medication term is probably a misnomer, because we know that people who use drugs and alcohol to self-medicate another psychiatric condition actually have a worsening of that psychiatric condition. So it doesn't make it better. In fact, over time, it makes it worse. And we have lots of data to support this. So, for example, we know that people who quit smoking cigarettes, if you follow them prospectively, their anxiety goes way down in the years after quitting smoking. So, in other words, the substance use initially may start as a form of self-medication, but it creates this vicious cycle where it makes the underlying psychiatric symptoms worse. And then people won't get better, even if you give them optimal treatment for their underlying psychiatric condition. You also have to combine it with treatment for their addiction.
So the patients are thinking they are solving a problem, but actually they're making it even worse. All right, okay. So let's say a patient comes to you saying, "Doc, I have a problem." Then you start treating him. Now, my big question when it comes to addictions was always, what about the relapses? So let's say somebody really manages, you help him out, and for a while, he did not use the substance, be it alcohol or cigarettes, whatever. What's the problem with maintaining behavior?
Well, the problem is that, number one, we do believe that chronic, especially heavy exposure, prolonged exposure to addictive substances can permanently change the brain. And there are some fascinating animal experiments to suggest that that may be true. The other piece of it is that on some level, addiction is a disease of learning. And we develop all kinds of cues and triggers that we associate with our substance use, such that even after a protracted period of abstinence, if the person is exposed to that cue that they associate with drug use, that can elicit intense cravings for that drug, such that they would relapse, even if they don't want to, or even if their lives are so much better. It kind of sets up this sort of vicious cycle. So, in other words, once people have been addicted, we do believe there are permanent brain changes that happen that make them more vulnerable to relapse than compared to people who have never been addicted.
Another thing which I wanted to, it's kind of like, please solve this one for me. For a while, I've been hearing that you can also get addicted to smartphones, particularly. I think it was also one of the engineers, I don't know if it was from Google, I don't want to misspoke now, who said that these things are designed as slot machines to basically make our neurological pathways to expect a reward, and then it's postponed by a split of seconds, so we don't get it instantly, but we have to wait for it, and then we get it, and this is why we get hooked. So from your perspective, how evil are smartphones when it comes to addiction?
Yeah. So I'll start by saying there's a lot of controversy among addiction experts about whether or not you could get addicted specifically to your smartphone. But there's a whole sort of category of what's called process addictions or behavioral addictions, things like sex, gambling, the internet, smartphones. And there's a lot of controversy in the addiction field about whether these constitute real addictions. My personal opinion is that they do. I base that partially on my clinical experience. I've treated a lot of people with behavioral addictions, addictions to gambling, addictions to sex, pornography, and smartphones. And gaming is another big one. More and more young people coming in with gaming addictions. And what I've seen in my clinical work is that the natural history of behavioral addictions is identical to the natural history of addiction to drugs and alcohol. And what I mean by that is people start out using the behavior either recreationally for fun or to solve a problem, like we've talked about before. Over time, they need more and more to get the same effect. That means they're progressing to daily use. Then they need higher and higher potency to get the same effect because their brain is changing and resetting their pleasure pathways. And pretty soon they find themselves investing all of their energy into getting the substance, using the substance, maybe lying about substance use, and then continuing that cycle the next day. And so similar is that pattern, whether it's alcohol and drugs or whether it's video games and pornography and sex, that I am convinced that the process in the brain is identical. Further, there is some work done, brain imaging work done, especially with gaming addiction, showing that people who engage in video games, for example, the very same parts of the brain that light up that dopamine reward pathway when people use drugs and alcohol light up or get activated when people engage in these kinds of very rewarding behaviors. Mm-hmm. So I am a big believer in this phenomenon, and I also agree that smartphones have been designed to keep us engaged. I mean, that's sort of the whole point, and that this is encouraging a kind of an addictive behavior in all of us.
Let's go to another topic. I'd like to talk to you about depression. Now, from my day-to-day perspective, when I talk to people, I have the feeling that somehow everybody is depressed today. That might be just my misconception of the whole thing, but a lot of people that I talk to, I feel like they're absolutely unhappy, unmotivated. They even sometimes say that they feel depressed. And the one thing which I don't understand, and here I would like to quote Dave Rubin, when he does his talks on college campuses, he always asks the audience, so the young college students, do you think you are better or worse off than your grandparents? Do you think you have it harder or easier? And the majority, or mostly everybody, always says, no, we are better off than our grandparents. The life is easier. We have more possibilities. Everything is somehow smoother. We don't have that many and hard challenges that our grandparents had. So if life got that much better in quality, why do so many people feel depressed? And why do we have perhaps even an epidemic of depression?
Right. So I have a whole theory about this, and I'm writing another book that is attempting to address this very topic. Yeah. So I don't want to get into too many details about it, but basically my theory is that the reason that we're all so miserable is because we're working so hard not to be miserable. In other words, if you think about the brain model of addiction that we have and the way that our pleasure set point gets changed with ongoing consumption of highly pleasurable activities, what we end up is because the brain, wants to adapt to that, we end up with a pleasure set point that makes it harder to experience pleasure. And I think that's essentially what's going on. You'll hear a lot of theories that, well, it's the income gap, it's that life is so much more anxiety provoking, it's all kinds of new diseases coming out. But really what I think it is that we're all sort of saturated with high dopamine consumption.
Okay, so we are setting the bar higher ourselves continuously, and that's why it's getting harder and harder to get there. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and then when we're not consuming, we're not engaging in. But basically, I think our pain threshold has changed, mm-hmm. and our ability to tolerate distress as nations has gone down. So the reason that we're miserable is because we're not really designed for comfortable living, right? I mean, we really evolved for a world of scarcity, and that's not the world that we live in now. And I think that we are not evolutionarily adapted, so we're miserable.
Which would get us to the next topic I wanted to talk to you about is the topic of spirituality. Now, the problem that I have lately with a lot of people, these words such as spirituality, mindfulness, mindset, they sell good. They're used often as a marketing tool to attract attention. People come, they're like, okay, what's going on? What can you tell me about my spirituality that is going to make my life better? But I guess a lot of people are only scratching on the surface of these words, never really getting deep into it. And I never so far, looked into it, didn't hear anybody defining what spirituality is and how can it help people to have a better life. So what is your take on that?
Well, first I would agree with you that words like spirituality and mindfulness have essentially been commercialized, and that people are sold these notions and consume these notions with the usual kind of feel-good mentality that pervades all of our culture. So, for example, even the concept of mindfulness, I think people think, well, I'm gonna practice mindfulness so that I feel good or I feel better. When in fact, that's not really the goal of mindfulness. If you're really engaging in in mindfulness, then you might feel really uncomfortable at what comes up for you, or you might really gain some insight into some serious character flaws.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, I totally agree with you that this has sort of been commercialized. I wouldn't want to presume to define spirituality. It is a nebulous term, but what I can tell you is that in my work with patients over the years, particularly patients with addiction, some kind of spiritual life is often fundamental to a positive transformation and a life worth living. But again, I would just emphasize that usually it's hard and it involves a lot of sacrifice. And it's not some kind of, feel-good pablum for the soul that is often marketed today.
Absolutely, I agree with you. The other thing which I wanted to talk to you about is it was after my podcast with Dr. Mark Gordon from the Millennial TBI. I don't know if you know him, if his work is known to you. So he's an endocrinologist, and he works a lot with veterans. He's trying to help them via his therapy with he claims that a lot of things, a lot of psychiatric conditions are coming also through hormonal deficiencies, which he's trying to regulate. And there I realized that, at least in my experience, from what I saw in the medical community, there is not really much exchange between fields which are, for me, at least now, more clearly very interconnected. So psychiatry, endocrinology, and I'm sure there is more of these fields which should and could cooperate, following the aim to help patients better with combining the knowledge. But I don't know, what's your experience in this interdisciplinary work?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this is a growing area of interest. This idea that you might get an infection, which launches an immune response, which then creates antibodies, which attach to parts of your body that actually then lead you to develop psychiatric symptoms. I mean, I think this is a very interesting and burgeoning field. It's not my area of expertise, but I think what it does is it sort of reawakens and reemphasizes the very important mind-body connection. We're so used to the kind of dualism that pervades most of medicine. This idea that your body and your mind are separate, and never the twain shall meet, and you've got a disease in your brain, and it's going to be different from a disease in your body. But we know that there are tons and tons of mind-body connections, that the way that you experience emotions and cognitions can have a huge impact on the rest of your body, and vice versa, right? So if you have a disease in your body, it's going to seriously affect, your emotions and cognitions. So I can say that I happen to work at an institution, Stanford University, where the interdisciplinary work is really exemplary. It's probably one of the standout features of Stanford is that people love to work across disciplines. We've got medical informatics, combined with basic neuroscience, combined with clinical neuroscience, combined with philosophy and humanities. So I think it's really important to do that, because if you get sort of siloed in your own individual area of expertise, after a while, you kind of run out of ideas. And sort of grind them, into the ground. Mm-hmm, but if you talk with people across disciplines, you can, it can open up new doors. You can see things with a new perspective.
Absolutely, more power to that idea. I'm a very big believer that working into the future, we need to adapt a more holistic approach to healthcare in general, and then treating any kind of conditions. I don't want to forget that you wrote a book, and I want to talk about that as well. Could you briefly tell our audience what the book is about and why did you write it?
Sure. So the book is called Drug Dealer MD: How Doctors Were Duped, Patients Got Hooked, and Why It's So Hard to Stop. Contrary to the title, it's not actually a condemnation of doctors. It's an attempt to explore the reasons for the opioid epidemic here in the United States, specifically looking at the phenomenon of opioid overprescribing that took hold in this country beginning in the early 1990s and escalating pretty much up until about 2012 when we started to see the first decreases in opioid prescribing. So what my book tries to do is look at the complex forces driving overprescribing inside of medicine. I touch on the influence of the pharmaceutical industry, specifically opioid manufacturers, and the way that they co-opted various watchdog organizations inside of medicine to drive overprescribing. But I also touch on other social factors, cultural factors, for example, the way in which our concept of experiencing pain today is different from the way it was 150 years ago. 150 years ago and earlier, doctors actually believed that pain was salutary, that it boosted the immune response, which it might actually do. That it boosted, the cardiac response, that it sped up healing. There was also this notion of spirituality, and that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Today, in the United States, we think that experiencing pain in any form, whether emotional or physical, is dangerous. That it leaves some kind of psychic scar that sets people up for pain going forward. And so, therefore, it has become the obligation of the doctor to eliminate pain at all cost. Not just because pain is painful, but because if you don't, maybe your patient will develop a post-traumatic stress disorder, or maybe your patient will develop a centralizing pain syndrome. So these kinds of cultural changes have likewise had a huge impact on this rush to prescribe pills to eliminate all suffering, when in fact there may be real value in suffering. This is not to invalidate the terrible pain that many people feel, but it's just to kind of more broadly paint some of the cultural changes. The other thing that I talk about is the toyotisation of medicine. And by that, I mean the way that we have developed a kind of assembly line approach where you've got a different doctor for every different body part. Everybody's prescribing a different pill. Many of those pills in combination can kill, and they work against each other. Doctors have very little time to see patients. They've got to get them in and out quickly. We've got primary care doctors in the United States seeing upwards of 40 patients a day. There's also a lot of churn because we don't have a universal health care system. People get a different job, their insurance changes, they have to change doctors. So this lack of continuity of care means that doctors are sort of left with prescribing a pill because that's all they can do in the absence of having any kind of real relationship with their patients.
Okay.
So those are the kinds of things I touch on in the book.
Sounds thrilling. I'll make sure that I get the book and read it as well.
Great.
Anna, thank you very much for taking your time, talking to me about all these topics. It was really a pleasure. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
This was The Voice of Medicine. Make sure you tune in next time and take care.